Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler. Now, Google, Meta, Apple, other tech giants are among Ireland's biggest employers and our biggest taxpayers, and they all have one Irish organisation in common, and that's the IDA, whose remit is to keep those jobs and investment coming in. But there may be some clouds on the horizon. We've tax reform to tariffs to the possibility of European overregulation possibly, and even subsidy races between countries seeking big investments. So will Ireland continue to reel in the big tech giants? And how much does all of that matter anyway? Should Ireland be trying to grow its own big tech companies and business employers? Well, Michael Lohan is the CEO of the IDA and joins us today to chat. Michael, thanks very much for coming into the show. Really appreciate it. I want to ask about Ireland's performance, the numbers and the prospects. But first, can I ask you about an issue that's very much in the news at the moment, which is the future US administration? And the candidate who's now favourite to win has promised a 10% tariff on imports from the likes of Ireland and Europe. Just from an IDA, from an Irish perspective, is that something that worries you?
Thanks, Adrian. So I think, when we look at global, I suppose, trade and you look at the connectivity of global trade, tariffs are certainly, an element that, to my mind, are going to be counterproductive for that global trade and for that global innovation. And we've seen that. We've seen that in the history as well, as that, as industry looks to innovate, and particularly I think for a small open economy, and indeed as we look to Europe as a whole, we have to look beyond our borders. We have to look to international markets.
Well, what could we do if they slap a 10% tariff on us?
Yeah, well, I think that certainly could at this point, I suppose it's nothing more than maybe a comment, in that context. But is that a means by which, if you think about the global trade between Ireland and the US, for example, like Ireland is the 9th largest investor in the US economy. And so would you think that that's a proactive? I don't believe it's a proactive thing to do, actually, to put tariffs on partners where you have a dual trade and a dual, I suppose, opportunity for innovation.
It's not you or I who's running for election.
Well, that is true. But ultimately, governments, when they look at this and look at international markets and look at international trade, they have to make those balances because, very few nations stand on their own in international markets. And while I do understand that, tariffs is one element, in terms of maybe protectionism, but there comes a downside of that. And the downside is that, you might conceive that you're protecting your own economy, but ultimately you actually could be hindering your economy's growth because it can lead to reactions. And as we know, what could spiral from that element is a tariff war or a trade war. And I don't think that's in anyone's benefit.
And I think a lot of economists are making that point. But from our point of view, nevertheless, is this something that we need to prepare for? Like if a minister asks you about this because you are on point for Ireland's inward investment strategy on the ground, what do you tell them? Do we say that we are preparing renewed focus on other areas of the world outside the US? How do we prepare for this?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. First of all, we have to put it in the context of that none of this is in place, right? So, and
do we not need to prepare?
Well, we always prepare, and I think as we look at global markets, that's what we do in IDA, and that's I think what the Irish government does, because we have to respond as an open economy. We have to be in a position to respond to those market dynamics and as they change. And maybe that is tariffs. And look, we've seen tariffs in the past. And during that past, we've seen them on different materials in different sectors. We see it on EVs at the moment. And it's that stopping flow. It's not. It's just changing flow and it's altering flow. So what we need to do in Ireland, and what we've been very good at, is we need to keep our pro-enterprise consistent policies. We need to be able to attach ourselves and align ourselves with those sectors that are of growth, which we have done successfully in the past. But we can't be complacent because undoubtedly what we see is that the competitive landscape for FDI has certainly changed. It has changed in terms of its scale. It's changed in terms of its intensity. And I think there is that element of geopolitical, I suppose, tension that has come into it, across all geographies.
I mean, the main reason I'm bringing this up is because Ireland is, according to the most recent Eurostat figures, Ireland is the EU country that seems to be most reliant on EU exports to non-EU countries. I think we're at about 51%, way ahead of anyone else. I think Luxembourg is next at about 30%. And I'm just wondering, does that not leave us especially vulnerable to a non-EU country that may well slap a 10% tariff on imports?
Potentially, you're correct. It is, but remember, as a small open economy, we are dependent on the economies of the world in any event. So it doesn't matter whether that's within Europe, within Asia, or indeed within North America. So that's a constant. That hasn't changed. And we can't do anything about our geographical location or size. That's where we are, and we're growing, whatever. But that's where we're going to be. We're dependent on an open economy and open trade. We're dependent on fair trade and balanced regulation. And I think what we can do and what we articulate and what the government always articulates is that there isn't really the model doesn't work if you're going to be in some ways restrictive or putting tariffs on each other, because that'll only cause a reaction, and that reaction certainly won't be to the benefit. Of course, there will be opportunities if that was to occur. If we were to run that and say, will there be a reaction from? Remember, it wouldn't just be a tariff in Ireland; it'd be a tariff outside of the jurisdiction that's opposing it.
To follow that thought, what is the potential opportunity there for us?
So in that case, then, if you were to run that through in that scenario, then companies will have to look at, well, obviously, if you're not going to be shipping product, across different international territories, well, then within the marketplace. Remember, Europe is a significant market on its own in terms of 500 million people within the European Union. That market opportunity is there. So you would potentially have to see a rebalancing, of activities and supply chains. As we know at the moment, supply chains and I suppose technology flow has been such that has been international, and it's been non-interrupted, and we've seen the benefit of that, not just in Ireland but across the globe. If that was to change, well, then I think the architecture around that would have to change, but there would be opportunities then to serve.
So we could possibly
larger
some
Europe,
of that up within Europe.
Within Europe, and maybe with other parts outside of Europe as well.
Yeah.
So they're the opportunities, but we're talking about hypotheticals here.
We are, and it'd be, but as I said, there's one particular candidate who happens to be favoured to win that race at the moment, and I guess it is incumbent on all of us to be perfect. One thing you did mention there a moment ago is regulation, balanced regulation, and in April you told the Financial Times that Europe is probably becoming a little bit too burdensome from a regulatory point of view, and that could impact innovation, and that you compared this to the system in the US, which is a little bit more agile, a little bit more responsive, and you warned about Europe putting itself into a position where it is not the location of choice for in particular for medical devices, for example. I'm just wondering, we've had in recent weeks quite a lot about this. Apple and Meta said that they weren't going to launch new AI services in Europe because of what they described as the unpredictability of regulation here. What they're really talking about is they don't really know who's in charge. But do you see similar effects in terms of overregulation here in Europe in general? We have the Digital Markets Act, we have the Digital Services Act, we've got financial stuff with DORA. Are we overregulating now?
Well, certainly we're at a different juncture, I think, in terms of regulation and as well, and I think that's recognised. And if you think, as and your question was asking about Europe, and I think we need to put it in that context in Europe. And if we look at the Letty report and the Draghi report, which is to come later in the summer, I think both of those point to that, in terms of Europe's competitive position, and within that Europe's ability to support innovation. And I don't think anyone is arguing over the necessity of regulation and the importance of regulation, as well. But we have to do is try and strike that balance. And there are examples, and you referenced one or two there. So if we take the example you mentioned of medical device, and I just back from a trip in the US last week as well, and this was articulated by companies in that space, is that if you roll the clock back 5 years ago, 10 years ago, Europe was the first location for a company to actually launch its product, in terms of getting CE approval, starting its commercial. And that's so important. If you're a large company or indeed a fledgling company, you have to get market access. Today, that's not the case. Today, it's in the US.
What has happened?
So what has happened is because I think it's two things. I think the US actually have probably got more agile in their processes, whereas in Europe we probably haven't. We haven't brought the same level of agility within it, and this can sometimes happen. The equilibrium can move, but I do think it's good to see within the European context that both the Letty report and the Draghi report are putting competitiveness and innovation at the heart of what Europe needs to do.
Do you think we need to ease off, take our foot off the accelerator then when it comes to major new regulations on business?
Yeah. I certainly think we need to make sure that we understand the implications of the regulation. And so, as I said, I do think regulation is important. And I think, like, let's be honest, it doesn't matter what sector you're in. We should be we need to protect the population and the users and so forth, and that is important. What we have to do is get the balance right. Make sure that it's not over-regulation or that there's unintended consequences. For example, in terms of capital markets or in the context of innovation and stimulating innovation, or indeed funding startups as well, which are the lifeblood, let's be honest, of that innovation side.
And bodies like yours, like the IDA, represent those interests. I'm wondering what the relationship is like between those who set these regulations in the European Commission and others and wider bodies and organisations like yours, because sometimes it feels like there are a number of lobbies in Europe, and as somebody who covers the tech industry, it has always been apparent to me that there isn't really a very strong pro-tech lobby in the EU compared to maybe other lobbies, privacy lobbies, etc. So what is the relationship between the IDA, organisations like yours, and those setting the rules? Do you feel that you have a voice? Do you feel you're listened to?
Yes, so I suppose our voice is through the Irish state and the Irish government. That's our voice, and we provide that feedback and input through that voice. So that's where our voice comes from. But on your other question, then, in terms of, if you want to call it, the mechanisms around maybe the tech industry versus other industry segments, there's no doubt in my mind that the regulation, within the tech industry is become, I suppose, it's become a heavier burden. It's become, more central to what the sector is doing. And in some ways, you have to develop that muscle almost, as a sector. And I think that's where the tech sector is actually at, is trying to develop and understand that, both from a sector perspective and a regulatory perspective. So I think the more we engage in that collectively, I think the more that muscle will be developed. And I would be hopeful that the more we do that, we'll actually see maybe more aligned outcomes from a regulatory perspective in terms of timing and implementation.
And look, in Dublin, we've actually created a mini industry of our own in regulatory tech, and the likes of OpenAI and other interests basically set their regulatory administrators here for that reason. And yet we have still seen giants like Meta and Apple say, we are not going to launch these new critical cutting-edge technologies because the regulatory climate there is such that we don't feel that we can. So we are losing out on those. It means we're not going to have things like new Ray-Ban glasses or Oculus headsets with that technology. So when we talk about exercising a muscle, what is it that we should be doing here?
Yeah, so I think, to my mind, right, it's about getting that balance between the regulator and the industry segment, and being able to articulate, the benefits. And indeed, you're correct. You have to articulate the benefits for the user, and in this case, the user is on the tech side, and that's obviously society as a whole. But balance that against, well, what's the regulation is there to try and, it's either to manage risk or to make sure there's an equal and fair level pitch in which people are competing. So it's making sure we balance those elements together, and that the regulators understand that. And I do think that, yes, there's a journey to go on that, but ultimately that's a journey we can travel, right? But it's going to require ongoing collaboration, and I think as well it's probably going to require a situation where there are some process changes within the regulatory system to allow for some of these new innovations and technologies. Because remember, as we go forward, technology, is across all sectors. It's across a lot of regulated sectors. So if you're in fintech, financial services, if you're in life sciences, there's regulation. And we've been able to innovate in those sectors. So this isn't beyond the realms of possibility. We just need to get to a point of common understanding.
I think many of us are happy that a lot of those regulations are there, because one of the biggest complaints about big tech companies, for example, is the potential for a dystopian scenario where they know too much about us, and Europe has been to the fore in setting those rules. Let me ask you about a couple of other things that have come up. You, in the half-yearly report, you talk about some of the challenges and the barriers that Ireland faces. How big is housing in that list?
So I think housing is well documented and spoken about in terms of capacity constraint. But the good news is we are making progress, albeit it took us a while to get momentum, and that's the very nature of capital investments. In all of its forms.
What I mean is, from an investment point of view, though,
Yeah.
do any of these? You're in the boardrooms with a lot of these companies. Does it ever come up?
Oh, absolutely, it comes up. Yeah, it does come up, and naturally you would expect it to come up because at the very forefront of, if you're looking to expand internationally, whether you're a first-time investor in Ireland or someone that's well established here, you understand the environment on the ground. You understand that when to attract talent, because the number one thing that comes up in every discussion is about people and talent, and in order to have people and talent, you need to have a home. So these two are intrinsically linked. So it does come up, but it's also recognised, when you put it in context, is that if you're a large international company or an international company, you understand in every location around the world there are challenges in terms of infrastructure and housing costs and so forth. So we're not unique in this, right? But I'm not trying to say that I'm not trying to downplay the scenario in Ireland. But we're not unique in it, but we are starting to respond. And, and I've said this openly before, is that what we need to do is continue that momentum of response. And we can see it. We can see it now in every city in Ireland. We can see it in regional growth centres as well. And that's important because we need it not just from an FDI perspective, but from a societal perspective.
From a societal perspective. From an FDI, you're saying that they can see this happening.
They can, absolutely. And they understand there is a plan and understand there's progress towards that.
Yeah.
And that's
what about other infrastructural stuff? I mean, there's too much for this podcast, but I mean, you can't take a light rail carriage from Dublin Airport to the city. I mean, which kind of sets the expectation and the tone for a lot of people when they first fly into Dublin. Like, how big of an issue is infrastructure in general when you're talking to these companies?
So I think in infrastructure, if we think about infrastructure, what's critically important to the clients we're dealing with, we spoke about housing. The next element, I think, is energy and power, right? And we're not, again, this is a challenge, that we have to look at in Ireland.
So who's looking for energy?
Well, to be honest, it doesn't matter what sector you're in. You require energy. And if you're looking at a large-scale manufacturing, site, whether you're in the life sciences sector, if you're looking at an engineering hub, you require energy. If you're looking at a data center, you require energy. If you're looking at a semiconductor site, you require energy. So no matter what we do, if you're looking at global business services, the lights have to go on. So energy is a requirement, I think, a base requirement. It's only a matter of what's the quantum you require for your business. But that's a key component because
they're worried, are they?
Well, sorry, I think to say they're worried would be an overstatement. I do think if you're a large energy user, such as a data centre, you're very familiar with the fact that Ireland is currently constrained in terms of capacity. But there is, again, I think there's the opportunity for us in terms of our offshore wind potential, actually to bring and reset the narrative in terms of energy generation.
Can I ask, how big an issue is that data center issue? Because you hear about it from two different perspectives. One, there's an industry perspective, and there's a tech industry perspective, which is, look, this is ludicrous. We need data centers to actually power modern services. Forget about your AI, just your normal Facebook and your YouTube stuff. And then on the other hand, there's the position which is data centers, consume an abnormally high amount of energy, and we don't have the grid. From your perspective, where is that argument now? How do you see it, and how do the companies that you talk to see it?
So look, I give you my view on this, right? And you started off talking about light rail, right? Data centers are the equivalent of the light rail system, right? They are integral to the technology sector, right? They're integral to all of our society. They're integral to how we actually go about and support our enterprise, our services, our public services. All of those are required, and what we need is that infrastructure, and data centers is a core component of that. So, to my mind, data centers have a central role to play in terms of technology. And technology, as I mentioned previously, is not just within the technology sector, it's across all sectors. So if you're looking to run hospitals, if you're looking to run our healthcare system, if you're looking to run the light rail we talked about, all of that requires innovation, technology.
Not to mention AI.
And that's been before we get to AI. So let's, and if we move then to the opportunity there is AI, and that opportunity, that requires, there's no doubt that the capacity we're seeing in terms of AI generation, AI data centers is at a scale above what's currently, I suppose, has been historically used. But there's also an opportunity in that, because remember, when we look at that AI future, And we're also trying to parry that or marry that with our ambition for offshore wind generation. We need demand in order to bring that supply on base. This gives an absolute opportunity to do that in a controlled manner that's going to be sustainable, so we can technologically advance and sustainably advance.
You use the word ambition, and that's a word that I come back to an awful lot when it comes to Ireland's aspiration in tech in a number of different ways. But I was in Finland on my holidays there 6 weeks ago, and I go to these towns and cities, and they have just decided that they're going to have a country that that works, that has a lot of industry, a lot of power. Okay, they've got more forest than anybody else in Europe. But in Ireland, the conversation around data centres, sometimes, is it not lacking ambition? What you're talking about there is a future vision to actually power industry and jobs and technology. And very often the narrative and discussion is about something else entirely. And it strikes me that ambition may be missing from that conversation.
Yeah, well, look, I think that certainly that's our ambition, and I do think we're going to see this articulated through central government as well. That ambition, because we clearly have an opportunity in Ireland to actually grow a sustainable source of energy generation. There is no doubt about that. That's not in question. What we have to do now is make sure we marry that and match that with a demand side, because without demand, you're not going to see that supply come. So this is an opportunity for us to do that. And while doing that transition in terms of energy and sustainability, we're also going to underpin our technology, our innovation in the country. We're going to underpin our ability to be part of that AI revolution that's coming. And remember that after AI, there's going to be further revolutions as well. So this is a journey in terms of technological evolution. It's not the end state, and we need to make sure we have infrastructure that's future proofed for that journey as well.
Okay, in the half yearly report. Direct employment by IDA companies, IDA clients, it's still huge. I think in 2023, the figure I have here is 300,583. That's 11% of total national employment. I think the slight net employment loss, there was a net employment loss of roughly 1,000 last year, mainly because of job cuts in the tech sector in particular. I mean, there's been plenty announced in the tech sector over the last 18 months, and some companies are still tightening their belts. Do you expect any more, or what does the scenario look like there?
So I think, first of all, to acknowledge, for the second year in succession, we were above the 300,000 mark. And it's been an incredible, if you think about it, journey for a decade in Ireland, where we've added, upwards of 100,000 jobs in the FDI portfolio over that period. So that's a significant shift in a relatively short period of time. And you couple that with, and that's mirrored, I think, in our population growth as well as a nation. So we see that. Do I see further shifts? Like what I see within the investment cycle at the moment is we're fortunate that, we have the world's best and leading companies in technology, in international financial services, in healthcare and biopharmaceuticals, and in high-value engineering. And we're fortunate we have those because we need that diversity as well within the FDI base. And what we're seeing is a change in that mix of investment. You're correct. We're at 11%, 12% of the population base. It's significant, but the output from that is equally significant. It accounts for 70% of our economic exports, for example, and obviously tech and life sciences being a significant contributor in those figures.
Which we hope is not going to be taxed 10%, by the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the scenario is that when you look at that innovation that's happening in those companies, underneath those figures, as we've risen from 150,000 employees up to 300, there has been a marked change in the type of activity that's happening within the FDI base as well. And just to give you maybe one indication of that, if you look over that 10-year cycle, the R&D investment within our client base has increased by almost 400%, up to 7 billion today. So you see, not only is it quantifiable in terms of the job number, but it's also very quantifiable in terms of the activity that's happening.
So that means higher paying jobs.
Correct. So we're seeing a deeper type of engagement. We're seeing strong R&D. We're seeing strong capital investment, and obviously that's reflecting in exports and the related impact that come from that from a taxation perspective.
Sometimes when people are thinking about Ireland's industrial future, and we think about our past and where we are now, and we look at the FDI jobs that are in, the Apples, the Googles, the Metas, the Microsofts, the Intels, all of the big pharma companies, many of whose taxes probably kept the lights on in Ireland during COVID. And yet there still is this nagging feeling that we are very dependent, 11, 12% of our national employment, on FDI jobs. And there's always this argument at the back of the room, which is, to say, are we too dependent on trying to get jobs into the country? Where is this idea of actually growing our own companies? Your job is to get jobs into the country and to get investment into the country. But at what point should that become less important to Ireland's national goal? Should we actually be developing more of our own jobs and depending less on companies abroad? If 3 or 4 of them left, our tax take would fall massively.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things in this. Now, first of all, I don't see personally, right, and I might say this sitting in my position, but I don't see where, FDI and Indigenous enterprise sit side by side, right? We are in the same parent department, we're sister agencies, and there's a lot that we actually collaborate together on. And for example, just last week, I was on a trade mission with Minister Burke, where we had both of our agencies, myself and my peer Leo Dlancy. We attend the same meetings, we talk about the interconnectivity between FDI and Indigenous companies, and how that actually interacts with each other. And when you look at that spillover and that connection between the supply chain of the FDI companies and how that actually has helped to support Indigenous companies, but also actually has given the platform for companies, Irish companies, to become global leaders in their particular field. And just to give you an example, last week we attended the office of PM Group in just outside of Boston, an Irish company who are world leaders in the biopharmaceutical and the tech industry. And where did they learn some of that trade? Here in Ireland, part of that engagement. So there's loads of successes actually to build on that. So I think they actually support and enable each other. And yes, we want to see more Irish companies. We want to see that actually embed. And that actually can happen with the FDI as well.
Yeah,
so there's a cross-fertilisation between both.
At that point is well taken. I do hear sometimes from startup owners here and Irish tech companies who say, oh my God, we're trying to compete with the multinationals for wages when they're trying to hire people in and the wage demands are 120, 150, 250 grand and they can't really afford them, which is slightly maybe different point. Just lastly, what's the pipeline like for the next couple of years for Ireland?
Yes, so the pipeline actually is remaining very robust as we look. Notwithstanding that, we need to be, and I've said this, I think, at the half-year results, is that we're not going to see the same level of exponential job growth because we're at 300,000, and the ability for us to add another 100,000 over the next decade is certainly a different proposition. And I think, we'd have to look at scaling in terms of our population.
I mean, it's not really possible, is what you're saying.
Well, I think at that scale in terms of job creation. But what is possible and what will be delivered is growth, and that growth will come in different forms. Yes, it'll come in job creation. It'll also come in deeper R&D. It'll come in the transition in terms of sustainability. It'll come on digitalisation. That's where you'll see the growth happening in the future. And it will also, if we think our half-year results for this year, of 131 investments, 1/3 of those investments were first-time new name investments. So Ireland's proposition remains very relevant, and I suppose it's resonating with companies, pro-business, stable, and, in a world of change, stability can mean a lot.
Just very finally, you studied electric engineering, I think, in what's now the Galway Mayo Institute of Technology. Way back when.
Way back, yeah.
Did you think you'd work at a state body? Now, you did work in private industry for a short while.
So I'm an electronic engineer I'd done pure play electronics I won't say when I done my leaving cert, but at the time it was the piece.
People can use Google.
Yeah, exactly. So worked in private industry for the first almost 8-9 years. Actually worked with a large telecoms company called Nortel Networks. People would be familiar with them. I think I always say this, and I've said this previously. My time with Nortel Networks as a global company, with an international facing role, probably forged me in terms of my development from an enterprise and a business perspective. And at that time, to be honest, I didn't think I'd be in a public sector job. I actually thought I'd be retired by the time I hit 35. That didn't happen either.
You still have a year or two to go.
Yeah, I still have a year or two to go. Yeah, absolutely. But certainly, have always enjoyed the enterprise engagement, and this role gives me all of that and more.
Okay. Well, listen, Michael Lowen, CEO of the IDA, thank you very much for coming in today. Gav Hennessy was on sound on this podcast today, and JJ Clark produced. I'm Adrian Weckler, and you've been listening to or watching The Big Tech Show. We'll talk to you soon.